the spirit of Castelnaudary, coldness of conscience, moral calculation, and the progressive awakening of responsibility. The testimony known as the Spirit of Castelnaudary, presented in the second part of Heaven and Hell, clearly exposes a spiritual state marked by coldness of conscience, the rationalization of evil, and the difficulty in recognizing the moral gravity of one's own actions. It is an emblematic account of how intelligence dissociated from ethics can sustain destructive behaviors without immediate remorse until the conscience awakens. The spirit manifests with mental lucidity, intact memory, and great argumentative capacity. In life, he guided his choices by personal interests, convenience, and cold calculation of consequences, without developing real empathy for the victims of his actions. After passing, this posture does not immediately disappear. He continues to justify himself, relativizing responsibilities, and trying to reduce the moral weight of what he has done. Modern depth psychology helps to understand this state. Rationalization is a defense mechanism that allows the individual to act against ethical values without experiencing conscious guilt. When repeated over time, it produces moral anesthesia. On the spiritual plane, where defenses begin to crumble, this anesthesia transforms into diffuse suffering, inner discomfort, and persistent unease. Spiritism clarifies that the suffering of the spirit of Castelnaudary is not an imposed punishment, but rather the result of the progressive shock between intellectual lucidity and the expansion of moral consciousness. He begins to perceive, albeit slowly, that his justifications do not nullify the real effects of his actions on other consciousnesses. This awakening is gradual, precisely because the inner hardening has been built up over a long time. Modern science reinforces this reading by demonstrating that empathy and ethical responsibility are not automatic. They need to be developed. When they are not cultivated, intelligence can be used to justify anything. On the spiritual plane, however, consciousness begins to operate in a broader field where the moral impact of actions becomes impossible to ignore indefinitely. Another striking point of this testimony is the initial absence of emotional regret. Unlike spirits dominated by immediate remorse, here there is a slower and more resistant process. Suffering arises not as intense pain, but as emptiness, restlessness, and continuous discomfort. This type of suffering is characteristic of consciousnesses that have not yet learned to feel the other as equal. Spiritism teaches that this state is not definitive. As the spirit of Castelnaudary begins to experience, even against its own will, the expansion of empathy and the perception of the harm caused, space opens up for conscious responsibility. Progress occurs when reason ceases to serve justification and begins to serve moral truth. This testimony brings a current and profound warning. In contexts where efficiency, results, or personal interest are placed above ethics, the story of the spirit of Castelnaudary shows that no rationalization protects the conscience from the consequences of what has been lived and caused. Intelligence without ethics does not liberate. It imprisons. The account also teaches that repentance is not the only initial path to progress. In some cases, the first step is persistent moral discomfort, which slowly erodes the defenses of the ego and compels the conscience to reconsider its own stance. Spiritual justice is patient, but inevitable in its invitation to learn. Reflecting on this testimony is an invitation to ethical vigilance in the present, questioning our own justifications, examining whether reason serves the good or merely self-interest, and developing conscious empathy now are ways to avoid long processes of suffering later. Conscience grows when intelligence learns to respond morally for its own actions. If this account has helped you reflect on responsibility, rationalization, and spiritual ethics, like, share, and leave your comment. Your participation helps this message reach more people.